introduction to this play will lead you to want to actually watch or read the entirety of this play. Our focus here is more specific to the question of satire. So let's jump really quickly now to our annotations. At level 1, go ahead and just summarize in a couple of lines, maybe three lines, the movement of this piece. Notice we've got basically 3 parts to this little cutting. 1, the first is obviously the two lovers, right? So you've got Jack, who is of course actually named as Earnest, who is saying to Gwendolyn, his would-be lover, "I really love you." Gwendolyn's response, "I would love any man who had the name of Earnest." Now let's get it in our notes right away. Earnest means what? Can you jot down what earnest usually means? Normally, students will say earnest equals honest. So note the irony already. We have Jack, who is actually not named Earnest, but is in fact named Jack, saying to Gwendolyn, "My name is Earnest." And she says, "I've always known I would fall in love and marry a man named Earnest." Now all of a sudden, Jack is a little bit worried. What's in a name? Juliet will have said from the balcony. "A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet." We just made a 3A observation, right? And yet here notice you've got Jack saying, "Well, I don't know about Earnest as being that great of a name. Come to think of it, I probably would be like, okay if my name was Jack." To which her response is, "Jack, good heavens no. What a crummy name Jack is." So you can kind of get a sense already of the irony of the first part of the cutting. Number 2, all of a sudden Gwendolyn's mom shows up, and she's going to separate the two. This will remind us of what we said in our study of Romeo and Juliet. Every time the two lovers are together, they always seem, in Romeo and Juliet, they always seem to be broken up by somebody older. The nurse, Friar Lawrence, the parents, whoever it is. And so you've got the same gig going on here in the second movement, and it's a very brief movement where she breaks the two apart, she separates and tells daughter, "Go downstairs to the carriage." And of course, at the very end, when her back is turned, right, mom's back is turned, you'll have the two of them blowing kisses to each other. So in other words, you've got a very silly representation. Let's put that in our notes at level 1. A very silly representation of two lovers who are ready to fall in love and get married at the drop of a hat, and especially the drop of a name, namely, of course, Earnest. Of course, the final part of the movement has specifically to do with the exchange, and this is the heart, really, of this cutting, the exchange between Jack, Earnest, and Lady Bracknell. Bracknell, of course, will be symbolic of, let's write that down, symbolic of, or representative of, all of the Victorian values that Oscar Wilde, the author of this text, is going to be making fun of. The notion that the only thing that really matters is appearances, right? Everything is about appearances, the way you look, the family you came from, and all of that. So obviously, Jack's got some questions he has to answer. Those questions begin with some of the most obvious questions and culminate with a surprising revelation, namely that Jack Earnest was actually found by a Mr. Worthing in the cloakroom of a train station where the child was left. In other words, he doesn't come from any serious parentage. Notice that Bracknell's suggestion is, well, you just need to get yourself a parent. You need to go and produce a parent. Obviously, Jack Earnest is going to have some problems just coming out of thin air with a parent, right? And then the cutting ends. All right, let's jump to level 2A really quickly and possible themes or messages for a cutting like this. Let's list at least 3. 1, obviously, as we saw in our study of Midsummer Night's Dream, as we saw in our study of Romeo and Juliet, love is silly. It's a silly thing. That is to say, you have two young people here who, instead of allowing parents to make arrangements for weddings, which is kind of the normal go-to in the Victorian era, you're going to let kids make their decision, and here, of course, children act in childlike ways. In other words, "Oh, I love your name is Earnest, I'll marry you." Of course, Jack's got some problems, and he says, "We've got to go and get christened. Get married." Christened meaning, and it's going to happen later in the play, he's going to actually go to try and get ready to change his name from Jack to Earnest, so that way he cannot be technically lying to his would-be wife, when in fact his name is actually Jack. Number 2, of course we're going to have the message here that the upper class has a certain view of the lower class in a condescending way. That is to say, they don't like the notion that the lower class should have any opportunities to affiliate or associate with the upper class. And you get this sense right away from Mama Bracknell, who's going to, all the way through her exchange with Jack, kind of look down on him as being lesser. And when she finds out he was born in a in a shoe, or found in a bag, then obviously we got all kinds of problems going on there. Number 3, the third possible message here that we could point out has to do specifically with this idea of appearances and realities. That everything is not what it appears to be at all. Jack is actually not Earnest. He is not actually this, well-known rich person, but was actually just found in a bag. Notice that Lady Bracknell's assumption is that probably his birth came out of some indiscretion, is the word that gets used. In other words, two people who are probably not married, hooked up, exchanged fluids, and had him, and then it wanted to get rid of him, and so they put him in a bag. In other words, she's very quickly ready to jump to the assumptions about Jack Earnest not being that good of a person because he was found in a bag. Notice the irony for Earnest. He's like, I can produce the bag, and I can even tell you about the bag and the way it looks, and I can tell you what line the train line was on. In other words, those kind of silly, insignificant things is what Jack Earnest is going to try to share. Mama's having none of it at all. Now, of course, at 2B, we already said this. This is pure satire. By the way, the entire play, you just die laughing all the way through, because the criticisms that Oscar Wilde makes of society, of the Victorian society, is still a critique that one can place today on a modern society, postmodern society. We still have this tendency, especially those in the very wealthy class, to kind of look down on those who are not in the wealthy class for the things they wear, their clothes, their driving vehicles, all of those kinds of things, their amount of money, how do you have your money, all of that still obviously matters. And to that degree, we have then here all kinds of satire being made. Let's list 3 possible satires here. One, obviously we've mentioned already, is making fun of young people and the ways in which they do silly things, like, for example, changing your name so when you're with certain people in London, you're perceived as a different person. Of course, doesn't it ever occur to you that sooner or later you're going to be found out by virtue of the fact that somebody from the city might want to come out to the country, etc. Number 2, since we mentioned it as city, country, let's put that there as well. We are satirizing the differences between people who live in the country and people who live in the city. Often Worland High School students are a little bit stung by this satire because, of course, students at Worland High School live in a town that's very, very small. And they are as well kind of tuned into that question that's often asked. You mean you don't have a mall in your town? What is up with you in that town then? How can you survive in a town where you don't have a mall? There's a debate then about, are people different who live in the country, rural, as opposed to living in the city? This has always been an ongoing debate, and obviously we're playing the game here satirically. No doubt we're also playing the game in terms of economics. The satire is an economic satire, a class satire, we might say. Those of the upper class have a tendency to look very much down on those of the lower class. And notice here that Lady Bracknell becomes then a symbol for Oscar Wilde of everything that's wrong with Victorian society. All right, let's jump to 3A really quickly. Jot down already for you, how does this relate to your reading of Romeo and Juliet and your reading of Midsummer Night's Dream? Obviously, they go together. What is for you the film that plays the game of kind of critiquing the differences between the two different groups of people, or maybe two different races of people? Are you familiar at all with a movie where, for example, a guy comes from the upper class and falls in love with a girl who's from the lower class, or vice versa? Or, for example, it can be a racial kind of thing, right? Just skin color matters. In the silliness that is our culture, sometimes people want to make these distinctions. What is the film for you that best, or the TV show, that best kind of cuts right through a lot of the silliness of these distinctions? And they are completely artificial distinctions. Lady Bracknell saying, hey, you just need to produce, right, some kind of a parent, and then we'll be okay. Finally, at 3B, we could ask this question to try to relate to a text like this. What's a moment in your life when you did something that was pretty silly, because you were young. We already mentioned with our study of Midsummer Night's Dream that love seems to make young people do really, really silly things. What is the experience in your life that comes to mind in that regards? To what degree do you still identify these silly distinctions in the halls of Worland High School? So, for example, somebody comes walking up to a group of girls and she doesn't have the right clothes on, or her hair isn't done the right way, and some of the girls become immediately the mean girl and look at her. Or she's dressed in one way and inappropriately. Or it happens in guy culture as well. If you don't go out for a certain sport, you may be considered a loser or something. To what degree does this kind of silliness still happen at Worland High School? And do you think it will forever be with us, or is there a way to maybe kind of transcend it? Well, there you go, an introduction to satire. I hope that maybe you'll find Oscar Wilde's classic and maybe read it or view it on your own. Thank you.